All right, welcome to Halitics. So glad to talk to you this Friday for the free for all. And I was super excited after yesterday's program when my good friend, environmentalist, and advocate for clean, green energy and for preserving our wild spaces, Maury Johnson, called me. He's now in East Palestine, Ohio. What are you doing there, Maury? And what's the situation in the site of that environmental disaster last year?
Hello, Hal. It's really great to be here. I'll get to East Palestine here in a second and why I happen to be here. So, as a lot of people know, I've been fighting a pipeline called Mountain Valley Pipeline. We all call it Mud in the Valley Pipeline. We'll talk about that a little bit. So, for some of those who don't know, I was one of 5 winners of the 2023 Community Sentinel Awards. It was issued to some people across the country. There's like 5 of us, and one this year. And when I was up in Pittsburgh last November, there was a conference called We Refuse to Die. And one of the places that we went to was here in East Palestine during that conference. And I met some wonderful people here in East Palestine. We visited the train derailment and some families here, and I said they was going to be having this anniversary. And there's a whole lot of stuff planned for tomorrow. People from all over the country, community, environmental and social and justice community leaders from all over the country will be here tomorrow. And I said, I'm coming up. We've got some great activities here tomorrow. They had asked President Biden to come. Now, we don't know if he's coming tomorrow. He said he's coming back here. He really should be here tomorrow, but we haven't heard he's coming. So over the past week, I started out in Virginia near my home with a protest against the banks financing the Mountain Valley Pipeline. I went from Blacksburg, Virginia to D.C. the next day. And then the next day I jumped on a train and went to, stopped at a friend's house in Baltimore, jumped on a train, went to New Haven, Connecticut. On Wednesday, we had a great protest in front of the Bank of America building right across from the Yale University. Come back on a train to Baltimore yesterday and drove over here, most of the way over here, so I can be protected.
Ooh, you just froze for a sec, Maury. We're losing. We got Maury frozen. The audio is, or the video. There, you just came back. We lost you for a sec. Go ahead. I don't want to lose you.
Okay, so tomorrow here in East Palestine, I'm just down the street. I just got here. I'm just down the street from where the train derailment happened. This has devastated this community. There's still lots. There'll be years of cleanup. I'm hoping that some of my East Palestine friends are on this call. Maybe they'll call in. We talked yesterday that maybe we could get them on next week with you, and you could have an hour with them. It's very important that the people never forget what happened here, because what happened here can happen in any place in America that has a pipeline or a train that carries all these chemicals. Safety has been a concern for these kinds of industries. It's all about making the most money with the least expense, and these citizens, like the people here in East Palestine, they suffer the external cost. We call them externalities. That's actually the name of a totem that's going to be placed here tomorrow, an externality. But I'm here to support my friends that I made in East Palestine and help keep awareness of all these issues in East Palestine.
Really appreciate that, Maury. Let me just jump in real quick, because I'm showing a headline here from Real News Network, which is a place you actually get news when you don't get it from the corporate media, the mainstream media, whatever you want to call it. And I was surprised by this headline. 1 year later, East Palestine residents want Norfolk Southern held accountable. This surprised me, because I already thought Norfolk Southern was, devoting many, many millions of dollars, maybe $1 billion to clean up. And apparently that's just not the case.
It's not. Well, they are devoting a lot of money to it, but it's not enough. One thing that they have asked for up here is long-term health testing. If anybody saw the movie Dark Waters about the C8 issue in Parkersburg, West Virginia, it took them many years before they forced DuPont to do long-term health testing. There are many people, friends of mine, people I've made close friends with, who are suffering health issues and they can't get the testing, they can't get the answers. Uh, there's lots of contaminated water here in this area, and we can't get an answer to. They can't get an answer to exactly what are they doing with that water. We know that there's a huge tank down here. It holds millions of gallons of water, and they're trucking that out and to somewhere else in Ohio where they're injecting it in the ground, and they're probably contaminating somebody else's water. So there's a lot of. This is a disaster that this country needs never to forget it. There's lessons to be learned here. I'm not sure we're learning the lessons.
One of the points made by the Biden administration is that the blame for this should be laid at the feet of Biden's opponent in the November election, Donald Trump, because he changed or loosened some train regulations regarding safety. Are you familiar with that, and can you respond to that charge?
I actually have friends that work for Norfolk Southern and CSX and other train companies. The problem was decades in building is a major factor in that. The previous administration is a factor in that. Like I said, loosen regulations. They want to deregulate everything and get rid of all these environmental and safety precautions because it costs the companies billions of dollars. And the people, like the people of East Palestine, have to suffer the consequences of a corporate CEO or stockholders or something making more money. That's exactly the same fight we were having with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Some of these things are not needed. This ethyl
I'm sorry, go
ethyl
ahead.
vinyl chloride is something that, do we really need it? Or maybe we do need it, but do we need it in such quantities as well? It's all about plastics. This whole train derailment is about, I think this shipment of chemicals originated in the Gulf Coast. Right where friends of mine in the Gulf Coast are having to suffer from these huge LNG plants and petrochemical plants, what is known as the nation's cancer alley. We have a cancer valley in West Virginia in the Kanawha and Ohio River. But these are usually the people that usually suffer these harms are the Native Americans and the low income Americans and the Black Americans and the Asian Americans. They put these facilities and they put this stuff where these social injustice communities have a hard time fighting back. So tomorrow,
we're calling them sacrifice zones because basically the people who live in them are sacrificed. They are disproportionately people of color who live in them. Although, as I may be wrong, East Palestine, not a sacrifice zone, it just was an area where the trains would rumble through.
It is still a low income
it's predominantly white working class. Is it? I'm sorry, Maury, just real quick. Predominantly white working class. Is that correct? East Palestine?
Predominantly, but I think this area is more of a low income area than a lot of areas of Ohio. But I'll let some of my friends from East Palestine area tell you the statistics on all that.
Well, in the end, it's just a failure of government. It's a failure of industry. It's a very, very clear sign that something is wrong, seriously wrong with our nation, and we must address it. You're watching Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. If you want to join Maury and me, he'll be here for another 10, 15 minutes, although he's kind of frozen now. I don't know. No, you're not. I thought you were. You were sitting so still. There was no movement.
I was looking at something going on I was looking at something going down the road. Another one of these big tanker trucks.
If you're one of Maury's friends, allies in Ohio, or you just want to weigh in on this topic, and I'll take calls on other subjects as well, Maury, I feel bad for my friend Chris, who was a first-time caller yesterday. We had made a tentative date for him to call back today, but I had to displace him for the first part of today's program because you called me afterwards, and I really want to give you pride of place, this is the time you can join us. I want to play this clip real quick from CBS Morning News this morning with an EPA representative on it. She's going to talk about the failure of the government agency tasked with oversight.
The derail train cars, and you bring the chemicals to a commercial hazardous waste disposal facility. This was unprecedented.
The EPA told us in a statement their personnel were present during ad hoc meetings leading up to the decision to vent and burn in East Palestine, but were not consulted about it, adding its role was to monitor the air.
If you're in the room, speak up. What's the point of being in the room if you're not going to share your expertise?
And the EPA did not speak up.
No, they stood by while this happened.
And what happened, Maury, was this toxic fog that was released from the tankers of the train that had derailed. And it kind of blows my mind. Why do that? As the EPA rep says, generally, when we've had other situations similarly, you go in with your crew, with these, hazmat crews, and they suck the toxic waste or the whatever. It's not, it isn't really waste, but the toxic materials, fumes, chemicals out, and then they dispose of them as safely. They're still never safe, and we probably need to move away from them altogether. But to the extent we can dispose of them without giving people cancer, that's generally done. Here, the Norfolk Southern just released it into the air, and the EPA just sort of twiddled its thumbs while this all happened.
Well, we're going to go back up. Let's back up a little bit before the train derailment even happened. The train wheels, I've been told, train wheels were on fire. Citizens that live a mile or farther actually saw it. Had they had the safety precautions that they should have had, they could have stopped that train and never had a derailment. But they continued to go right into Middle East Palestine, where the wheels failed. So it was a disaster from the beginning, and then it ruptured the tank, and they were trying. I don't know if it was maybe a lack of training. People just didn't do their job. I'm not going to throw blame on anybody. That's a question that needs to be answered. We need to make sure this never, ever, ever, ever happens anywhere else. It should have never happened here. And I'll let somebody else decide about that. But I'm just here to say, do whatever little bit I can do to keep this in the forefront of environmental disasters. I'm just a small voice in this whole fight. I learned about this firsthand. I mean, I knew where it was at. I'm in southern West Virginia. This is about 30 miles north of the northern panhandle of West Virginia. So I kind of knew the area, knew what was going on when it happened. But coming down here last November, early November, and seeing the devastation that's still happening, and nobody's telling people things they should know. For instance, a friend of mine, person I made friends with, lives right straight across the street, and she has this beautiful apple tree in her yard. And we were there, and there was apples on the ground. She says, well, normally we pick these up and make apple butter and apple pies and give neighbors, but we're not touching these apples because the insects won't touch them. They're toxic. Well, surely they're toxic. Even the insects won't even eat these apples. It says people come along and grab them and want to eat them. And we say, you probably don't want to do that. And you'll never want to. The soil in this whole area is contaminated. This is why this has not been called a EPA Superfund cleanup site is beyond me. Because this is a Superfund site if there ever was one. Norfolk Southern needs to, and I just heard where they're trying to change some of the safety rules that they agreed to this past summer. They're still trying.
Oh, we just lost you again, Maury, for a sec. You froze. So Maury Johnson, environmental advocate, friend of Halitics. There, you came back. We lost you for a sec. Go ahead. But let me just real quick, Maury, what you're saying is that that Norfolk Southern is now trying to backtrack on an agreement to act in a more safety conscious way.
That's what I read this week. So I'm have more. Anyway, Hal, So I'm in East Palestine for this week. I was supposed to be in D.C. next week with some of my friends from the Gulf Coast who are going to have a sit in the Department of Energy, but the Biden administration has says they're going to give a temporary pause on those permits. Well, that word temporary is
Isn't
not
it a
sitting
little
well with
late
me
in the
and others.
game too? I mean, as I understand it, a lot of those facilities are going great guns. That's not going to stop. It's just that some of the ones that were still pending are being reviewed, apparently. Or am I wrong on that?
Yeah. So hopefully next week I can get some of the maybe John Beard, maybe Sharon Levine or Rosette Ozane or James Hyde or some of those folks to maybe call in, or maybe you can do an hour with him. And then, of course, I'm still fighting the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which was a project that we had basically killed until the corrupt senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, and others put it into the debt ceiling bill that it had to be completed, that all the permits that were illegal had been struck down would be reissued, and we couldn't. So we're still fighting a bunch of stuff. Mountain Valley Pipeline feels like that they can do anything now, and they are. West Virginia DEP and the Virginia DEQ is not enforcing the clean water rules. So I've deemed this mud in Nevada pipeline. So I'll maybe next week I'll be talking to you
Before I
about that.
let you go, real quick, I know you got to run, and we had you for a short window, and we're also losing you a little bit. But are you a little bit I mean, last time we spoke, you were very down on the Biden administration. Does the pause that was ordered on the LNG facility permitting change your mind a little bit? Are you like, well, maybe Biden ain't so bad. Maybe we really do need to choose him over Trump. Or are you like, I still am. They're both awful.
Trump
I can't deal with this.
Trump can never, ever, ever, ever get close to the White House again. It will be hundreds of times worse. In a contest between Biden and Trump, I hope Biden wins. I mean, I'm still in West Virginia. It doesn't matter who I vote for. So I won't vote for Biden because I can't do that. But in swing states, people are just maybe going to have to hold their nose and make sure that Trump never gets back in office. And you can't be voting.
Oh, we just lost Maury again. So this has been kind of a little bit of a struggle, but it was worth it to get an on-the-ground voice. Maury, I heard what you were saying. I think we're going to let you go, but your point is that you're in a state where it doesn't matter. It's going for Trump, period. Doesn't matter. You might as well vote for your conscience, but you believe in states like maybe Ohio or other where it's on the nice edge. You gotta
Michigan, Wisconsin, yes. I mean, we cannot let Trump get anywhere near the White House. Maybe the big house, but not the White House.
All right, Maury, thank you for joining me. We'll get you back soon.
We'll talk next week, Hal, and I hope you.
Oh, we keep losing Maury, so I'm sorry about that.
East Palestine, Ohio. Check out, I think maybe Beyond Plastics Appalachia page is going to have some stuff. I'll put some stuff on the Preserve Monroe Facebook page for people about what's happening tomorrow, and my own personal page, and share some links later this evening. But if you're near East Palestine, Ohio tomorrow, come out here. We need people to.
Well, we need people to do something. I assume just stand and show the support for the community and demands that some kind of true redress be provided for the victims of this environmental disaster. Maury, thank you. And
maybe if you're in D.C., you can take a sign down in front of the White House and say, remember East Palestine.
All right. Well, we'll urge folks to do that as well. We'll see Maury next week. I'm going to just, let's see if I can get rid of that. Just to go to Just Hal. See if I can get Just Hal here. There we go. Again, Maury, thanks so much. You're watching Halitics. You're listening to Halitics. 242-5646 if you want to join me. And I want to just show a video from East Palestine. I didn't want to take the time from Maury. And honestly, this is not an area I'm pretty arrogant. I like to think I know best about everything, but obviously I don't. So this is an area where I'm pretty remiss, really don't know all the facts on the ground, how serious it is. This is a video from AP that I wanted to share because I think it gives you a flavor, right, of what, just like we play videos of what the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, is doing to Gaza, to the people of Gaza. And I think you get a better, understanding than you do just by hearing me, whine and complain about how bad things are. When you actually see the suffering, the victims of brutality, it really can make a difference, I think, in people's responses and how they ultimately decide to act. And I think when we, this lady here, let me get that video visible, and we'll play it now. This is from the Associated Press. I thought they did a real good job here, so here we go.
Sam Cherico's skin hasn't been the same since February of last year.
I've been to the doctors. I've had biopsies, punch biopsies done. They come back chemical dermatitis. Paid big money for different creams and lotions, and they don't work. And the medication they want to give me, the steroids, I'm diabetic, so I can't stay on them. They raise my sugar, which causes more issues. So I'm kind of scarred for life.
The 59-year-old lives just over 1 mile from the site where a Norfolk Southern train carrying toxic chemicals derailed and caught fire last year. Sam first met reporters with the Associated Press while she was evacuating her home on February 6th.
Run.
Minutes before officials blew open 5 tank cars containing vinyl chloride because they worried they might explode. The sound of trains has long been a staple of life in East Palestine.
It was like a bird chirping because I was so used to them. But now, no.
Now it's a reminder of the accident that spilled a cocktail of hazardous chemicals in the town. Officials say the contaminated soil and water have since been removed.
We know that contamination did not reach groundwater, and we know that the drinking water is safe.
And Norfolk Southern is still in town.
So I want to just stop that. You heard the EPA rep say, we know the water's safe. It didn't reach the groundwater. But Maury just told us that a woman's apples are completely shunned now by the bugs. The insects that used to eat the apples, they would see the insects on the apples, now will not go near them. So people won't either. And so I you know what, I trust the insects more than the EPA. The EPA that just stood by and said, release the toxic fog. So, I mean, we cannot trust government. Government is corrupt. Our government, I mean, everyone, look, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. We live in a remarkably unfair, unjust society when it comes to wealth distribution. And power brokers and politicians enjoy tremendous perks especially if and when they act in ways that corporate America, that billionaire elites want. And it doesn't matter whether you want it or not. So if the EPA spokeswoman comes on and says, we know the water's fine, we know that the groundwater's not contaminated, we know that the soil's okay, then Norfolk Southern is really happy because there's not going to be a huge groundswell of opinion saying, no, we need to have much more regulations. We need to really tightly enforce them. We need to hold accountable the managers who acted so recklessly and so irresponsibly. But if you flack for a billion-dollar company, well, you're going to get rewarded somehow, some way. Somebody's going to be leaving you a nice gift under your Christmas tree.
Restoring the site of the derailment.
We want the village to get back to where it was before and really trying to keep whatever impacts we have really at as small as can be.
But resident Misty Allison says she still sees those impacts today on her 2-year-old daughter Audrey and 8-year-old son Blake.
We live very close to the school, so on nice days I'll walk to pick him up. And I remember once he jumped in a puddle And he stopped and looked at me and said, "Is vinyl chloride in this puddle?"
It's a term that wouldn't be in his vocabulary if not for the derailment.
Hopefully in 10 years from now, even though this is part of our story, that big plume isn't what everybody sees. This is my husband's hometown. He's a fourth generation East Palestine resident. And we lived all over Boston and Michigan and Cleveland, and we chose to live here.
Patrick Orsagas, Associated Press, in East Palestine, Ohio.
All right, I thought AP did a good job with that story. They did have the paid spokesperson from Norfolk Southern say, "Oh yeah, the community's back to work," and they had the EPA flack say, "Yeah, it's not in the groundwater, it's not in the soil," but the voices of the residents spoke louder. The images of the skin condition suffered by one of the residents we saw at the beginning, and then the mom talking about her son and the chloride in the water puddles. I think that tells the tale. The answer is we've got to wrest wealth and power from these billionaire elites and from the corporations that they control. That's really the only way we can get our society back. I love Maury. He is an incredible advocate for the environment. He is somebody who is a victim of the oil and gas and coal industry with the pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline going through his land. And he's fought that great fight for a decade, I believe, to stop it. And ultimately, Joe Biden and Joe Manchin, with Biden's help, defeated the forces that were trying to preserve some parts of West Virginia. So I love Maury, and I appreciate greatly that he's a friend of this program. But ultimately, we part ways when it comes to whether there's some kind of imperative to vote for Joe Biden. I just cannot see how that would be better. Somebody who has demonstrated repeatedly fealty to corporate elites and has not, to my knowledge, visited East Palestine, whose interests, whose main focus right now is perpetuating endless war in Gaza and Israel, keeping the Israeli military totally all systems go to continue genocidal acts against Gaza, and in Ukraine as well. A terrible war that's led to, I believe now we have over 100,000 deaths, maybe 500,000 casualties in one of the most, war-torn areas over time, not just right now, but, over the past 120 years. Trench warfare is just the norm in Ukraine. At least it was in the first war, the Great War, World War I, and then just a site of killing, a killing zone by the Nazis in World War II. And now more death, more destruction, more carnage in Ukraine, and Joe Biden getting his way with the NATO, and I guess the Euro community, EU, committing some 50 billion euros. Is that right? Yeah, 50 billion euros, I believe that is correct, to rebuild Ukraine. And that's fine, but it's also going to be used. I mean, yeah, let's rebuild it. The country is a complete disaster. 50 billion euros. But of course, a lot of that money is going to find its way to the military so that they can continue a stalemate with Russia with more death, more carnage, more destruction, rather than insisting on demanding that there be peace. All right, we've got John. John, it's great to hear from you. Good Friday to you. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Good morning. Hey, Hal, do you realize that you just made it sound as though as though Joe Biden compelled the European Union to give $50 billion in aid to Ukraine, when in fact that's not what happened. They gave the aid to Ukraine because they know that this conflict could potentially lead to an existential threat at their door. Could you be a little more honest when you report on these things, please?
This is a money that Europeans, many of whom are really struggling financially right now. The EU is not doing as well economically as the United States. The Eurozone has led to, again, just like in this country, free trade has decimated some communities. It's not as bad in Europe. They have a much tighter safety net. I get all that. But nevertheless, you have winners and losers in Europe. Many countries are struggling in debt. The European economy is not that strong compared to the United States. This is something that Joe Biden wanted. Joe Biden pushed for that money to be released. He just thanked the chief of the EU for this. And
yeah,
I don't know why. I understand what you're saying, John, that the European countries, the European leaders, the liberal elites in Europe don't want this war to continue. But I disagree with you that it's somehow in the interests of the citizens of Europe that it continue. And I certainly disagree that's in the interest of Ukraine. The solution has to be a negotiation with Russia, a ceasefire, and an end to the hostilities. And if that means Russia keeps East Ukraine, so be it.
So are you there?
I'm here. Go ahead. I'm listening.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay. So just because Joe Biden liked the...
Oh, you're fading. Okay, so John, that's not me. I just lost you. I just lost you completely. You came back, but I lost you completely after you said, even if Joe Biden likes it. I think that was the words I caught, and then you were gone.
Okay, can you hear me?
I do.
Okay, so even if Joe Biden liked the outcome of what happened in the European Union yesterday, it doesn't mean that he compelled it. It doesn't mean that it happened because it was his will. You know, he may have wanted it to happen, but it happened because it was the will of all of the leaders of those countries. They felt it was so important to get that aid to Ukraine, to stop the Russians in Ukraine, that they were willing to rescind Hungary's voting rights in the European Union. They were willing to, to punish them for not going along with this. So, I mean, if it really wasn't in their interest and it wasn't in their will, they could just say, well, sorry, this kind of got vetoed by one of our members. We can't do it. But they realize how important this is. They realize that if the Russians take over that land, that they suddenly, I mean, you've got more capital. You know, the Russians will have snowballing wealth at that point. They'll use that land to generate more income and build more tanks and buy more military hardware from Korea and from China. And yeah, maybe they'll go for Estonia or Latvia next. You know, it just, and maybe they'll coordinate it with China and say, here, you go for Taiwan and we'll go for, this over here. And it seems to be that the Europeans are taking this threat seriously, and they're not doing it just because the Americans want them to.
John, when does it end? When does the killing end? I remember we talked about this. Let me just I just want to put a little or a little supplement to the question. I remember you and I discussed this, I believe, at the beginning of the summer, and you expressed real optimism for the surge over the summer, the counteroffensive that Ukraine was launching. That, frankly, was a bust. It was a bust in terms of recapturing land, and it's led to many more deaths and land destroyed. Russia is digging in. They're not going to give up. When does this end?
You have misrepresented my point of view. I express optimism when they finally take possession of those F-16s that they're training on and they get longer range, more precise artillery that can hit a target very accurately within 300 kilometers. I believe they got the first round of those just recently. The reason they're in a stalemate is because they can knock out that supply chain that's coming over that bridge, and they've got to be able to rain down on that and on the rail system that's bringing in supplies on the other side of the bridge, which they have access to certain parts of it with their current artillery. But this is a very strategic thing. They need these more advanced weapons so that they can realistically cut the Russian supply off and start pushing them back. And that's going to be a long process because they have to go through minefields to do it. So, I mean, it just, these things don't happen overnight. You can't have instant gratification when you're trying to get your country back from the Russians.
John, these things don't happen overnight, but people die in a matter of moments, in a matter of seconds, over and over.
They do.
Homes
and
are
you know
destroyed.
What?
Domiciles are blown up. Mm-hmm. And we are not innocent. We are not simply, in Ukraine, even the Ukraine government is not wholly unresponsible for this either. They did pursue, Zelensky did pursue NATO membership. This is a problem that has resulted because Europe and the United States was provoking Moscow just as much as the other way. And our obligation should right now be, we're just going to have to agree to this. We're just going to have to disagree, because I believe our obligation should be to prevent more deaths right now and to figure out how we can come to some acceptable response or solution with Russia. All right, I'm shutting up. You go ahead.
Okay, so those countries joined NATO of their own free will. They had duly elected representatives that reached out to NATO and said, we would like to join. And they did it for their protection, for their safety. They knew that the Russians were capable of doing what they're doing to Ukraine right now, and they did not want that happening to them. And Ukraine knew that they were capable of it, and that's why they were reaching out to us as well. That's why they want to be a part of it. We're not compelling them to be a part of NATO. They've reached out to us. And they decided they wanted democracy. They didn't want autocracy, which is what they knew the Russians were going to push on them. And they reached out to us. And NATO should be open to any country that is willing to put the resources in, the amount of resources in that's required, whatever portion of their GDP that's required, and that wants to be a free country, that wants to have, to elect its leaders. And so, I mean, the way you present your argument, you present it in such a way as though the United States and Russia should negotiate over what happens to Ukraine. Ukraine's destiny should be in the hands of Ukraine. And if they want to fight for their country and they ask for help, we should give them our help. And that's exactly what they're doing. They've got women in combat roles. They've got women out there fighting in the infantry and fighting and as forward observers for artillery and working as snipers in trees on the front line, picking off enemy infantry. They got women on the front lines out there fighting. They're volunteering to do this. They're not being drafted. They're volunteering to do it. These Ukrainians, they want their country back.
Yeah, I mean, I just ultimately don't share your views that this is somehow a goal of the Ukrainian citizens, that being part of NATO is more important to them than not being killed by Russia, by Russians. I don't buy that. I don't buy that peace has to come by destroying or defeating Russia on the battlefield. I think that that's wrong. I think that Russia is the big
Is there
bully
of
on the
getting
block,
Russia out
and
of
you
Ukraine?
deal with it, and you don't just simply say we're going to fight you until everybody's dead. But I guess that's
what
what a lot of
alternative-
people think has to be done.
What alternative is there to getting Russia out of Ukraine?
Well,
Completely
if
out of
that's
Ukraine.
your goal, if your goal is only we've got to go back to sort of pre-2014 borders or whatever, get them out of Crimea, then yeah, there's going to be a war. But if your goal is to come up with some solution that will end the killing, end the fighting, and leave Ukraine an independent, viable state where people can live and have a decent life, then you call for a ceasefire and you talk about a demilitarized zone between the two countries. You talk about what's a fair border. And also, you do talk to Putin about potential self-determination for the people on the in the disputed areas. But what you don't do is just hunker down and say there's not going to ever be peace until Russia leaves, because that ain't going to happen.
So can I ask you a question? Russia has been quite brutal with these people, raping them and kidnapping their children and whatnot.
Well, that's what we hear. But we hear that, but we also know that Ukraine is an incredibly corrupt country. We know that if you criticize Ukraine in Ukraine, you can be disappeared. We know that there was a guy who was broadcasting. I don't know how credible the guy was, but he was saying things that the Ukraine government didn't like, and he's dead now. He was taken into captivity. He was an American citizen. He was taken into captivity, and he's dead now. So, I mean, it's not like Ukraine is some paragon of democracy, just like the United States isn't a paragon of democracy.
I think there's context missing there, Hal. I think, which members of the government were they? The members that are under Russian influence, or is it the Zelensky regime? But I got a question for you. Should the French and the Brits have just thrown up their arms and said to Hitler, look, just don't kill us. You can have whatever you want. You can do whatever you want to do to the Jews. We just want peace. Should they have done that?
No, and that's not what we should be saying to Putin either. What we should be saying to Putin is, how do we stop this? Let's end this right now. That's what we should be doing.
Seriously? You really believe he's just gonna,
Of course, this isn't in Russia's benefit. This is making Putin less popular at home. There's a lot of criticism in Russia. They don't like all the killing either. There's Russian families losing their loved ones or off at war for a long period of time. It's very expensive. Of course, I think Putin would be responsive to serious peace overtures. And there's a lot of reports that we have actually pressured Ukraine not to engage in conversations. I remember playing a clip from you, and this is going to be the end for me. I'm going to let you have a final word, John, because I want to thank you for calling in. Then I'm going to move on. But Anthony Blinken went into Helsinki, and he flat out said over in the spring that there's no conversation with Putin until they leave, until they move back, until they withdraw.
Yeah, but the thing you continually ignore on that is that they tried to have a conversation with Putin in the beginning of this conflict several dozen times, and they thought they struck some sort of accord with him, and then the Russians, within hours or even minutes, violate the accord. They even.
Oh, we just lost you again, John. I'll count to. We lost you one more time. All right, well, I'll let him go because we were kind of at the end. We're at an impasse. I don't know where you're
getting your news from. It just seems,
John, we lost you for another 5, 10, 15 seconds. I did hear you. You said that there had been overtures in the past and that they were either rebuffed by Putin or he, in fact, agreed, and then he pulled back. And then you said, where are you getting your news from? I heard that. So anything else, or do you want to?
Yeah, they can't trust Putin. They've struck several accords with Putin, and he went back on all of them.
All right. Well, I'm going to look into that. I'm going to take that under advisement. I appreciate that. I want to look more into that. I know there's been quite a bit of back and forth over who's responsible for the failure to engage in negotiations and the failure to when there have been some negotiations. John, thanks for the call. Have a great weekend. I really, really appreciate it. I want to just add, though, that even if it's true that most of the blame is on Putin for failing to follow through on offers to negotiate, on pledges, even if that were true, you still keep trying. You still keep pushing. You still keep making the effort. Because what's the alternative? I think we're pretty much at 100,000 dead Ukrainians. It was at 70K last year. I saw a number there. So I mean, all this pointing fingers, everyone's going to say, well, it's the other one's fault, or we did everything right and they're to blame. Okay, but tell that to the corpses that are littering the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. Tell that to the families that have seen their domiciles destroyed by Russian missiles. Their lives are destroyed. I don't want more lives destroyed for this, in this absurd conflict that we, the West, and Zelensky are far from blameless. All right, I want to get to, and I really did appreciate, by the way, Chris calling yesterday. I just wanted to show, I had said I was going to discuss this today. I don't know, we've got about 10 more minutes before the program, before I cut it. Although, if I get a call, I'll go a little late. But I just wanted to show his comment that we discussed briefly yesterday, because I think, and he may disagree, I think to some extent there's a misunderstanding, and maybe that's on me and I wasn't clear. But this was the post that that Chris, calling himself Inside Deluxe 2, put on in response to my discussion, and specifically the question I posed to Jill Stein about identity politics and how to build what I, some multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. And what he says, what Chris said online, is that equals don't bring up slavery and the history of Black Americans because it makes white people feel bad. It's like you're saying being Black is divisive, and having a historical identity is what stops white people from doing the right thing. Black people using history to determine their politics is the problem. Really bad take. So if I gave the impression that that's my view, I mispresented it. That's not what I think. I mean, I don't believe what is suggested, I believe, by RC here. I do think we should absolutely discuss slavery. I think Black American history, African American history, whatever you want to call it, is American history. I mean, I don't think you can separate out the experiences of any particular group of people from the broader history of this country. So, of course, we should talk about what happened and the specific victimization of African Americans, or of first Africans, and then when they became African Americans, how it continued in its most vicious form, slavery, but through Jim Crow and even today. I think that's really important. I don't disagree that it should be discussed. I think we may disagree, though. So I agree with you that that's all really important. And if it makes some people feel bad, so be it. I mean, the truth is the truth. I think the problem, or I think where we disagree, is if we elevate, is where I disagree with some activists who are, multi-ethnic, multiracial activists who I think elevate victimhood or being a member, let me say it differently, being a member of a traditionally victimized group as thereby, because you're a member of a group that has suffered and that may disproportionately suffer now, you're entitled just by virtue of being a member of that group to some type of special dispensations. And that's where I don't agree. That's where I have an issue. I think we look at current conditions or what happened to you specifically as an individual. And that's what society has a duty to redress. So you brought up yesterday the experience of the Japanese who were interned during World War II. And they did receive redress, reparations for that. And I think that was appropriate. People who were wrongly locked up and kept in a concentration camp for years simply because they were of Japanese descent, that's wrong. Those people were specifically harmed directly. Their freedom was taken away from them, and they should be compensated for that. That was clearly wrong. And I think it's good that Congress authorized that redress. It was a step towards making things better. We should have provided redress for the enslaved people. But we don't have today people who are enslaved. What we do have is a group of people who are their descendants, many of whom, a disproportionate number of whom, are poor, or are, if not poor, working class, who don't have enough to live as full a life as they should, because as human beings, we all should have a full life. But descendants of American slaves aren't the only people who are facing that exact predicament. So I would say everyone who is facing that predicament should be compensated, should be guaranteed the necessities of a good life. And then on the other hand, you do have people who benefited disproportionately from evil, from enslaving people. And they're dead too. But their descendants, some of them may also be extremely rich, affluent, and so they need to pay. Just as everyone who has more than they should have, they have too much, should have to pay. And I mean, that to me is a solution. Now, if you say to me, "What? But how? There's still discrimination against African Americans. They're still being redlined. The vestiges of slavery haven't gone away." And my response there is, okay, bring a class action suit. You have a family that was unable to purchase a home in a nice neighborhood, and or I don't want to say nice, but they were steered away from a particular neighborhood, or they couldn't get a fair loan because of their color of their skin. Well, we need to investigate, and those folks should be compensated. They should get redress because they were directly harmed. They individually were victims of bad behavior, of wrongdoing. And so we should compensate them. The other issue I have is because any kind of injustice benefits some people and it hurts others. But it doesn't benefit everybody. Slavery benefited economically some people, the owners of the enslavers, the people who traded in human traffickers. But there were white people who didn't benefit, that were harmed by it. So that's why I don't want to pit. This is where I think we have maybe a disagreement. I think it's important not to pit white people against black people with language or even with history. We should talk about slavery. We should talk about the way it was used by elites to enrich themselves with zero regard whatsoever for the people that they harmed. That's really important. I think it's also really important to point out how this country moved from more of an indentured servitude model, which included white servants who were brought, to this country from poor areas like Ireland, poor parts of Germany and the like, and where they were treated very badly, although they were not slaves. They were not enslaved people. They were ultimately able to become free at some point, but they also were clearly exploited and abused. And that model was abandoned in part because it led to poor whites or indentured whites and enslaved or indentured African Americans joining forces. So racism was used, the typical antipathy that people from different groups have towards each other, that tribalism, that racism was used to prevent whites and blacks from joining forces, to have enslaved people at the bottom of rung of the ladder, but also where poor whites were also kept in often miserable economic conditions. I think that's part of the history that we do need to discuss, part of slavery that we need to discuss. That's where I am. We can disagree about the history and we can fight over that, and I'm sure I'm wrong about certain things, but that's the way I see it. And I think terms like white supremacy, that's why I oppose it, because I think it mischaracterizes society today, and I think it also does make it harder to bring people together to fight against the injustices, and ultimately to fight for what I think is critical, which is everyone has enough, nobody has too much. All right, it's a little early. I really enjoyed John's call. A little bit. Maybe I didn't enjoy it so much because we don't agree. I really appreciated that Maury called in from East Palestine, giving us an update, and we'll talk more about the environment. We'll talk more about LNG. We'll talk more about the problems of a fossil fuel-based economy like the one we live in, the petrostate that is the United States. That'll all be next week. You guys have a great weekend. I'll be back.